coalition. On the other hand, it's fair to say that though the government has never forced Israelis to settle in the West Bank, that seems perfectly true, the government has been very deeply implicated in these movements by subsidizing mortgages and prices, by providing superior high school and other education, by providing infrastructure of electricity and water, and of course, perhaps most importantly, by defending the settlers and the settlements through use of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. So it seems to be deeply implicated in the entire position. The features of some of the features of these settlements, Israeli law is applied to the Jews living in the settlements extraterritorially for all matters involving Jews. Palestinian law has no application whatsoever, even if events occur outside the settlements and involve both Jews and Palestinians. The settlements occupy about 40% of the total territory of the West Bank, and the settlers have increased from about 10,000 after the 1967 war, when Israel gained control of these territories. In 1970, there were about 10,000 settlers there, including East Jerusalem. By 2000, it had reached 380,000. By where we are today, it's approximately 500,000 settlers, both in East Jerusalem, 200,000 and 300,000 in the West Bank. In this area, there are roughly 2.5 million Arabs. So you can see the implications. There are serious violations of human rights. Perhaps most important, I would say, in this very quick summary, the problem of discrimination that's inevitable. You have an occupier and an occupied. The occupier decides within limits set by these international treaties, and the occupied people are subject to the bayonet, subject to the force of the occupying power. Most people would agree there have been serious violations of the governing instruments, including forms of discrimination in many aspects of their life, which have led to more and more use of the rhetoric of potential apartheid were these settlements to continue, rather than be solved in a peace treaty that would draw definitive boundaries between the countries. That discrimination stemming from different bodies of law that are applied, different areas where Jews and Arabs live, and total denial of all political rights. It's one reason we urge so much a two-state solution rather than a one-state solution, which would continue the struggle for supremacy in one country of one or the other, and the demographics here are going to be very close. Internationally, the Israeli occupation has received no recognition, I believe, from any other country, certainly no other country of any significance. The settlements are roundly condemned as illegal under these conventions, and Israel has annexed parts of East Jerusalem and other parts. None of these annexations have been recognized by other countries. So this is the situation. It's one that cries for a solution for the good of Israel as well as the good of the Palestinians. It is a thorny, deep problem that continues to plague and impede efforts toward a two-state or indeed any form of solution.
Thank you so much, Henry. Professor Cox.
I joined this group rather late after it had been working for a couple years, and I suppose they asked me to join because given the fact that we're dealing with Israel and Palestine, perhaps they thought someone who knew a little bit about religion should be part of this group. This is, after all, what has been called for many years the Holy Land, the Sacra Terra. At the heart of it is the city of Jerusalem, and I wrote the chapter on Jerusalem in this book, which has had over 700,000 hits, I'm sure, by now, which we invite you to read. Jerusalem has been called the holy city, the city holy for three faiths, which indeed it is, for Jews, for Christians, and for Muslims. It is, the institutions and holy sites that were mentioned earlier by Professor Martin are still there, are still visited in increasing numbers by adherents of those three different religious traditions. And there they are, cheek by jowl, as a kind of challenge to the whole atmosphere of ecumenical relations and interfaith relations as they impinge on political issues. Now, I do not believe that the Middle East issue and the Jerusalem issue is mainly a religious issue. I don't think it is. I don't think it's a struggle between Islam and Judaism or anything of that nature. I do think, however, that religion is a factor which has to be taken into consideration as we move toward a solution to this very difficult and stubborn conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Now, think about it. The Middle East is in some ways at the heart of tensions all around the world. At the center of the Middle East stands Palestine and Israel. At the center of Palestine-Israel stands the city of Jerusalem. At the center of the city of Jerusalem is the Temple Mount, the Western Wall. If we could only decide how to live together in that center, perhaps the peripheries around the edges would begin to take care of themselves. So we have some suggestions in our report for how we can live together. These are not original. These have been advanced by groups of rabbis, by the World Council of Churches, by the Vatican, by Muslim scholars and imams. In fact, the situation is ripe for precisely the kind of compromise that we have picked up on and are advancing, not having invented it. And that would mean that in Jerusalem, as mentioned before, the Jewish neighborhoods, largely in the West, would be under Israeli sovereignty. The Palestinian neighborhoods, largely in the East, would be under Palestinian sovereignty. At the center is what is called the Old City. The Old City accounts for 1% of the entire size of modern Jerusalem. When we read about Jerusalem in the old days, the Old City was Jerusalem. Now, the Old City is only a very tiny part, but a highly symbolic, volatile, and important part. And we think it should be shared. Jerusalem should be shared. Neighborhoods, east and west, and perhaps in the center, in the Old City, the old walled city, there could be an international commission, an interfaith commission of Muslims, Christians, and Jews of various varieties that would administer it. It is in many ways an international city of interest and importance far beyond Palestinians and Israelis. A few years ago, I was teaching in Jerusalem at something called the Elijah Institute, one of the most remarkable institutions I've ever visited or taught in. The faculty consisted of Orthodox Jews, Reformed Jews, Catholics, Protestants, 2 Muslims, a Hindu, and a Buddhist. Believe it or not. Just imagine the faculty meetings. Yeah, and me, right. One day, we all trooped over to the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif. Went up to the top and stood there, and it was the Hindu who said to me, "This is a holy place." He doesn't belong to any one of the 3 Western traditions, but he had a sense somehow that this was a city that was important to all peoples of all faiths all around the world. It cries out, as Henry Steiner has just said, for some kind of a move. The move is not a hard one. All it requires is political and moral will to take this step, which is waiting to be taken. And if the Jerusalem issue can be faced and solved in some way, we think the rest might follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harvey. Steve will take over now.
Right. Thank you. Insecurity and fear have been a central part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for decades, and my chapter in our volume tries to address some of the security issues that would be involved in any sort of 2-state solution. What I want to do, rather than just summarizing the chapter, is briefly summarize why 2 states would make Palestinians, Israelis, and Americans all more secure. Let me just go through each. With respect to Palestinians, a state of their own would obviously be of enormous security benefit to the Palestinians, who essentially have no real security at present. Palestinians are the largest population of stateless people in the world, which means they have no sovereign government to protect their interests anywhere. As Henry already noted, Palestinians in the West Bank have been under foreign military occupation since 1967, which places very heavy restrictions on them, very heavy burdens. Palestinians in Gaza are in a state of siege today. Palestinians in both places, of course, have faced recurring violence. According to the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, approximately 1,200 Palestinians were killed between 2005 and 2008. That's before the Gaza war, by the way. About half of them civilians, about a quarter of them children. Another 1,400 died in the Gaza war as well. Israeli casualties in the Gaza war, by the way, were 16 killed. It's not just the conflict with Israel, of course. Palestinians are often very badly treated in parts of the Arab world as well, which again is what happens to stateless peoples, unfortunately, in many parts of the world. So even if a future Palestinian state were largely demilitarized, it would still be an enormous advance in their security and well-being. In fact, the real puzzle, which I do address in the chapter, is how do you create genuine security for a Palestinian state that would be largely disarmed, would be in perpetuity substantially weaker than all of its neighbors? And I think that's a very tricky problem. With respect to Israel, two states would make Israelis more secure. First point to understand here is that Israel's security situation is in fact substantially better than it used to be and much better than many people think. Israel has fought every war that it has fought, or won every war it's fought, at least up through 2006, the war in Lebanon. Israel used to face the combined opposition of the entire Arab world. It now has peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, an offer of full peace from the entire Arab League. If you go back to pre-1967, Israel's defense budget was about half that of the various neighboring states. Today, its defense budget is substantially larger than the combined defense budgets of its neighbors. It has several hundred nuclear weapons. It has the strongest military in the region, which means that no one is throwing Israelis into the sea either now or at any time in the future, which is very good news. Moreover, its security situation has been altered because it no longer faces a significant conventional military threat, which means that territory on the West Bank might give it strategic depth. Today, the sorts of threats Israel might face would be either terrorists or long-range missiles, and territory doesn't give you protection against either of those things. The real long-term threat to Israel is demographic, or delegitimation on the world stage. And of course, it's the occupation that makes both of those problems worse. Two states solves both the potential danger from demographic changes, the rising Arab population, and also the potential threat from delegitimation on the world stage. And I'll just add, and we may get to this in the Q&A, I don't believe the recent events in Egypt alter anything I've said here. I think they actually just reinforce the fact that military superiority and territorial control is not the long-term key to security. It is regional acceptance that is the long-term guarantee there. Peace there requiring not just security arrangements, but ultimately changes in attitudes on both sides as well. The great puzzle here is that even if a two-state solution were agreed upon tomorrow, it would not be implemented overnight. And one does want to think about the security arrangements that would have to be put in place to reassure Israelis as the institutions, the full institutions of a Palestinian state were being corrected. And we talk in the paper about possibility of some kind of international peacekeeping force which would involve American participation to sort of bridge that period of transition. Finally, a two-state solution would make the United States more secure as well. The combination of the occupation and America's special relationship with Israel fuels an enormous amount of anti-Americanism in the Arab and Islamic world. It is one of the things that motivates al-Qaeda, not the only thing, but one of the things. It is certainly a potent recruiting tool that groups like that use.